This is part two of the executive branch lecture, and we're going to finish discussing the president's powers and the president's roles. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And the president has a great amount of latitude in that role. While Congress can criticize him, Congress has funding authority over wars and military purchases and can certainly question. They have some oversight authority in terms of being able to appoint generals and being able to fund certain military systems. When it comes to the prosecution of a war, the direction that the war is going in. The president has the authority to do that, and Congress can only question him with regards to that. Yes, they can threaten to withdraw funds, but since troops are often committed to war, withdrawing of funds while troops are committed to war is not a realistic um, threat for the president, because at that point you are leaving the troops, almost abandoning troops to be killed in war, and that's just not going to be done. It is political suicide, and also almost just the concept almost seems traitorous. While the Congress, under the Constitution, has the power to declare war, the president can commit troops, even without a declaration of war, short of a declaration of war. The last declared war was World War II. The nation has fought in a number of conflicts since the 1940s and since World War II. They fought in the Korean conflict, the Vietnam conflict, Desert Storm 1. They have fought in Bosnia. We have in the war on terror. We've been in Iraq and Afghanistan. So since World War II, we've not had a declaration of war by Congress, but we have had American troops committed to fighting in a war zone. There is always some tension between Congress and the executive branch as to when a war needs to be declared, when the president can commit troops to harm's way without the declaration of war. And that has always been, in fact, Congress passed the War Powers Act, and all the presidents have gone in and said that War Powers Act is unconstitutional because of the expansive role of the president in the military. This is a recognition that during times of trauma, you need one voice, one command. You do not need multiple voices, and that therefore the president is the commander in chief, and as the Constitution grants, and therefore is the person that will direct the military. Realistically, the nation must respond to threats internationally. And therefore, during Pearl Harbor or 9/11, you could not expect the president to go and seek a declaration of war in order to commit U.S. troops in harm's way. The president has to have the authority to respond to national or international threats in a rapid manner, and therefore the Constitution contemplates the commander-in-chief engaging U.S. troops short of a declaration of war. The president has some legislative powers also. The president submits recommendations to the Congress. Let's go back. The presidents run on a platform and they have an agenda for the nation, and governors also do. In order to implement that agenda, the president has to establish a budget which will fund his policy or her policy proposals and programs, and which would in turn implement the agenda that the president has promised the American people. The president would also, in trying to move the agenda forward, seek for Congress to enact laws, programs, create agencies, create regulations, which again implement the agenda that the president is fostering. The president, in the State of the Union, generally sets forth a clarification of that agenda, while you run on sort of platitudes and some generalities. By the time you get to the State of the Union, the president has to have put together how his team plans, or her team plans, to implement the agenda. What budgetary changes will take place, what laws will take place, changes in the law will take place, what programmatic changes will take place, what rules will be changed in order to implement the president's agenda. And we're going to take a little look now at President Obama as he gives his State of the Union address, and sort of outlining the Obama agenda.
This year, we've broken through the stalemate between left and right by launching a national competition to improve our schools. And the idea here is simple. Instead of rewarding failure, we only reward success. Instead of funding the status quo, we only invest in reform. Reform that raises student achievement, inspires students to excel in math and science, and turns around failing schools that steal the future of too many young Americans, from rural communities to the inner city. In the 21st century, the best anti-poverty program around is a world-class education. And in this country, the success of our children cannot depend more on where they live than on their potential. When we renew the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we will work with Congress to expand these reforms to all 50 states. Still, in this economy, a high school diploma no longer guarantees a good job. That's why I urge the Senate to follow the House and pass a bill that will revitalize our community colleges, which are a career pathway to the children of so many working families. To make college more affordable, this bill will finally end the unwarranted taxpayer subsidies that go to banks for student loans. Instead, let's take that money and give families a $10,000 tax credit for 4 years of college and increase Pell Grants. And let's tell another 1 million students that when they graduate, they will be required to pay only 10% of their income on student loans. And all of their debt will be forgiven after 20 years, and forgiven after 10 years if they choose a career in public service. Because in the United States of America, no one should go broke because they chose to go to college. And by the way, it's time for colleges and universities to get serious about cutting their own costs, because they too have a responsibility to help solve this problem.
Besides the veto, which we will talk about on the next slide, the president also can call a special session of Congress to address an issue. And what that does is it focuses the Congress's attention on that special issue and focuses public opinion and public attention on the Congress and how they address that public issue, that issue of public policy. What that does is it puts the Congress in a fish tank and therefore puts pressure on the Congress to engage in agenda setting that is consistent with the president. The that is a very seldom used tactic at the president's level, but I will say at the state level, it is done quite often. You would recall that Governor Hunt called a special session back when the General Assembly did not enact a budget, just went on and let the biennial budget stand, which impacted schools. And Governor Hunt then called together the leaders of the major groups of employees, calling together the president of the university system, the president of the superintendent of public instruction, the state personnel director, and the head of the judiciary to come and before the press begin to talk about the impact of the lack of budget on how we would operate the various branches of government. He put pressure on the General Assembly in essence. The president has one single legislative vote that is more powerful than all of Congress and all of the Senate, and that is called his veto. The president can determine whether a law is implemented based upon the veto. While he cannot pass a law, he can stop a law, and that is a powerful tool because it takes 2/3 of the Senate and the House to override the veto. What that veto it was given to the president, but it was a compromise because many did not want the president to have this authority, but others wanted it because they thought the president needed to have some manner of check over a Congress, but not wanting to vest too much power in a singular individual, they also then gave Congress the right to override that veto with a 2/3 or supermajority. The president can veto a bill or address a bill in several ways. He can sign the bill and therefore make it law. The president will generally sign a bill when the president, by and large, approves of the bill, and the bill would not cause the president to have to expend political capital. Basically, when he or she does the cost benefit analysis from a political standpoint, it is more to the president's benefit than to the president's detriment. Therefore, the president will sign the bill. The president can veto the law, and veto is when the president basically signs a veto, and he basically does not allow the law to be enacted, and these vetoes occur because the bill violates the president's political philosophy. Many times it'll occur when the bill would weaken the office of the president, or it violates a campaign promise. In essence, the president looks at it in the political costs if he does not veto are higher, and because the veto in some instances is very important to some political constituency, the president wants to make sure he's out in front and appeasing that political constituency. In one of the clips you'll see discussion about Bush vetoing a child health insurance bill. And part of that was because of Bush's trying to appease a constituency of the American Medical Association, the doctors who always worry about government control of health care, and also appease conservatives who don't as much care, who have a philosophical leaning that government is not there to provide social safety nets, that people should be pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, and therefore this bill, which expands the cost of government, makes big government, is going into an area that government should not be in. So you'll see some discussion about Bush's veto because he, in essence, was playing to that constituency that we just discussed. While Congress is in session, the president can merely not touch a bill and it will pass. The president does that when the law is not necessarily to his pleasing or her pleasing, but it's not worth a veto. It is the political cost of the veto may be higher than and the policy cost of a veto may be higher than he is willing to, or she is willing to pay, and therefore, while the president does not want to associate themselves with the bill, the president does also not want to pay the cost of the political price that comes with the vetoing. The final way the president can handle a bill is just do a pocket veto. While Congress is not in session, he just doesn't touch the bill, and it is vetoed. And the president would do this in instances in which the president disagrees with the bill, but there is enough of a political constituency that's important to the president that he, again, doesn't want to be associated with the vetoing of the bill, but he also does not want the bill to be enacted. Now let's show the video clip.
Many Republicans fear President Bush's veto of a bill to boost spending on children's health insurance could play a role in next year's election. CBS News senior White House correspondent Bill Plant has details. Bill, good morning.
Morning, Russ. This veto sets up an all-out war as Democrats try to override it with the help of a lot of Republicans and an election year coming up. The president says he's not against insurance for poor kids, just big spending and government-controlled medicine. And he says he's willing to make a deal.
And if they need a little more money in the bill to help us meet the objective of getting help for poor children, I'm more than willing to sit down with the leaders and find a way to do so.
The state children's health insurance program gets federal money to help cover medical costs for about 6 million children whose families can't afford their own health insurance. Democrats in Congress, along with a lot of Republicans, passed a bill that would cover an additional 4 million children. It would cost $35 billion. That would come from raising the tax on cigarettes by 61 cents. The president, who proposed spending only $5 billion more, charges that this bill would be the beginning of a government-run health system.
I don't want the federal government making decisions for doctors and customers.
The argument now is whether the Democrats can get enough votes to override Mr. Bush's veto. The Senate is no problem, but in the House they're about 15 votes shy.
And so the President of the United States is asking 15 Republicans to stand with him on an argument about government-run health care and deny American kids health care, and yet vote at the same time to give Iraq $190 billion.
That's how the Democrats are going to frame the argument, and because they control the scheduling, they're going to stretch this out for 2 weeks before they vote. Look for a lot of Republicans to be joining and trying to get this bill into law without the president's signature. Russ?
Bill Platt at the White House. Thank you.
A major part of the president's arsenal of powers is his or her judicial powers. These powers coming again from Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution are given to the president, and which again would be his check over the judicial system, meaning a person the judicial system may have adjudged in one way, the president can change it. The president and there's no check on these powers except one. The president can change the sentence of any criminal offense that's a federal criminal offense. He cannot. The president does not have these judicial powers over state charges, but in a federal instance, he has the authority to modify any sentence, except the president cannot use his or her judicial powers with regards to the impeachment of him or herself. That's the only check on the president's judicial powers. In most instances, or in many instances, I should say, the president generally seeks the opinion of the Justice Department, and that opinion is given after some investigation and a report is issued. But the president is not bridled and does not have to take that opinion and can give a pardon even though the Justice Department doesn't recommend it. And in fact, presidents have done so, or can exercise judicial power even without the Justice Department's approval. The judicial powers fall into 4 categories. He can pardon someone, and that is just the United States forgives you for the crime, and therefore you are forgiven, and that is sort of the most blanket kind of exercising of the judicial authority. Amnesty basically recognizes that the person has indeed engaged in a criminal activity, or a group has engaged in criminal activity, but you're going to give amnesty. You're going to waive prosecution or waive criminal sanctions against them. The discussion about aliens, illegal aliens, is they're violating the law. What the discussion is, should we give them some amnesty? Should there be a blanket? Amnesty is generally given to a group of people. So should we give that group of aliens who's are people who are not native, who are not natural born American citizens, and who are not American citizens properly, should we give them, even though they're in the country and violating the law, should we give them amnesty, forgive them, pardon them as a group from for their criminal activity? I might also add those who went to Canada rather than fight in the Vietnam War were violating a criminal act, and in order for them to be able to come back in the country and not face prosecution, there had to be some action by the president, because those were they had violated a federal criminal law, and so President Carter issued an amnesty for those people who had engaged in who had gone to Canada during the Vietnam era. Reprieves. Reprieve is when an individual has been sentenced, but the president would then issue a reprieve, which delays the enactment of the sentence. They can postpone it for a day, a minute, or they can postpone it forever if they would like. Generally, if they postpone it forever, there's going to be some kind of either pardon or commutation, and that brings us to commutation. Commutation is when the president basically reduces the sentence. basically says that I'm going to reduce the sentence either to time served so that you can get out immediately, or reduce the sentence down to 0 so that you never have to go in. In fact, what you'll see in the next film clip is President Bush exercising his judicial powers of commutation. In commutation, what he did was he reduced the sentence that was properly issued by a court, a federal court, to Scooter Libby, and he reduced that sentence down to 0 so that Scooter Libby wouldn't have to stay away from his children and his family, is what they made the argument. But basically, Scooter Libby had outed a spy, worked for the vice president. He outed a spy, a United States spy. Basically, I showed the identity, or told the identity of a U.S. spy in violation of U.S. law, and in fact endangering the spy's life. It was done for a political purpose, and Bush thought that his aide, or the vice president's aide, needed to be protected, and that's why he commuted the sentence.
Douglas Brinkley is a presidential historian and CBS News consultant. Good morning, Doug.
Good morning, Hannah.
So take us through this a little bit. Why did the president decide on commutation without a formal request from Libby and without consulting with the Justice Department?
Well, he obviously didn't want the specter of Libby in jail, and that was about to happen. For one thing, it would be fraught with peril if you have somebody that knows so much about the insider information on the war in Iraq, somebody who was so close to Dick Cheney, suddenly stewing in a jail cell. There's always a fear that some deal would be made to tell more about other people, a revengeful memoir that could be written. In this case, President Bush doesn't have that worry anymore. Libby's grateful, Libby's family's grateful, and the president's just had to do the hard news here. He did it right before the 4th of July, hoping that this story will peak today and then kind of disappear in a day or two. But anyway, you slice it, this isn't a great moment for President Bush. History's not going to look kindly on the president for rendering this verdict.
And folks on both sides are unhappy because some conservatives, as Bill Plant mentioned, were pushing for a pardon to nullify the conviction. Why did the president decide on this path? Why not a pardon? Was he worried about the repercussions of that?
I think he worried about the repercussions of history, the stench that would leave. I think by doing it this way, he could say, look, I am a man of the rule of the law. I just don't like excessive punishment. It's kind of playing it in his mind down the middle. And the conservatives are generally happy. If you look at people like Fred Thompson, for example, who's been pushing very hard for a pardon, he'll take this. So I think basically President Bush has placated the right. They're grumbling a little. Today's Wall Street Journal op-ed piece does not like it. They're coming at it from the right. They think it should have been a full pardon, and this way it makes it look like Bush is covering up for a guilty man by doing the commutation. But generally speaking, the noise we're going to hear from this is coming largely from the left.
And some people are saying the president could only do this because he has nothing to lose. He's a lame duck. He's got low approval ratings. Are these the kind of controversial decisions that we would see a president make at this point in his administration?
I think that's right. I mean, the immigration bill just went up in flames. War in Iraq is giving him a bit of a lame duck status. It's going to be a rough September coming with a lot of moderate Republicans bolting from President Bush. It's getting to the point some candidates don't want to be seen on the right with Bush. They don't want to even be in a picture with him. So he doesn't have all that much to lose. However, it's all a question, the Libby case. This could be 2 days from now forgotten. It depends how much noise Harry Reid and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama want to make of this, how much mileage they think they can get, as Hillary Clinton said, is about the cronyism issue. Is this a corrupt White House? Can Democrats running for the presidency in 2008 constantly bring up the Libby specter, and will that influence voters? And I think only time will tell.
And as the majority leader Harry Reid said, history will judge the president harshly for this. That's his belief. Douglas Brinkley, thank you so much for being with us
Thanks,
this morning.
Hannah.
We appreciate it.
A final note on the president's criminal judicial powers. A pardon does nullify the conviction. So basically it takes a legitimate act of a court and sort of sets it aside. The executive branch, the president, also sits in a quasi-judicial role. Each one of the agencies of the federal government, or a large number of them, has regulatory power over businesses or individuals engaged in certain activities. In order to implement those regulatory, in order to implement their regulatory authority granted by some congressional act. For example, the EPA has regulatory authority over environmental issues granted by the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and various other environmental acts. In order to implement those acts, federal agencies will promulgate, in essence, pass rules. Those rules will set up or how the agency operates, but they also regulate the conduct of businesses or individuals engaged in activity covered by their rules. So someone dumping, discharging plant waste into the water would be governed by the Environmental Protection Act. Agencies have enforcement divisions and judicial divisions, and then the enforcement division will go out and see whether or not a regulated organization or person has violated the rules. They will make a determination about whether those rules have been violated and may bring some kind of complaint. And that goes into the agency's due process side and their judicial side. And a hearings officer would then hold a hearing to make a determination about whether or not the rule has indeed been violated. That's the quasi-judicial side, where now a person in the executive branch is looking at and having a due process hearing to determine whether or not a rule has been violated and whether or not a penalty should be assessed or whether or not they should lose their license. In essence, should they lose property as a result of their action, money or their license. And in order to do that, the Constitution requires that you have to have some level of due process, and these agencies provide that due process, and all of those agencies are within the bailiwick, the province of the president, and the president, therefore, and the president's cabinet and major directors sit in a quasi-judicial role. Please also note, however, that all of these decisions of these agencies can be appealed to a court, and generally they're going to, depending on the regulatory scheme, it would be appealed to a federal district court or to could be appealed to the Court of Appeals. The president has a number of roles. Some of these roles are clearly defined in the Constitution. Some of these roles are inherent in the president's job. And some of these roles arise out of tradition and practice. But they're basically 8 major roles. Some of them we've already had a significant amount of discussion, and we're just going to lightly touch upon each of them and see a few clips which give you an example of the president in those various roles. The president is the chief executive of the American government, and in this role the president is allowed to ensure that laws of the nation are carried out. In fact, that is his responsibility in accordance with the Constitution. The president is the chief diplomat of the nation. The nation should speak with one voice, and the president is allowed to establish the foreign policy and speak for the nation, and in fact represent the nation in the UN and at other nations. The president is the chief legislator. It is the president's goal, objective, to submit his ideas for new laws to the Congress, The Constitution establishes the State of the Union, a unusual situation where the executive branch, because remember, these are separate branches of government, but it is the unusual situation where the executive branch goes to the legislative branch and speaks to the legislative branch. And in fact, there has to be formally extended, even though the Constitution allows for it, formally extended an invitation by the legislative branch for the executive branch to come and speak to them. That's at both a state level and a federal level. But he or she is the chief architect of the legislative agenda. The president is also the chief citizen of them. As the chief citizen, the president is said to be the nation's conscience-in-chief, the nation's consoler-in-chief, and the nation's challenger-in-chief. As the conscience-in-chief, the president is the moral leader, the figurehead. You heard in an earlier part of this lecture, Thurgood Marshall criticizing Eisenhower for his failure to speak to the nation and raise the morals of the nation to address the issues of segregation. I have an example now on the other side of that of Kennedy actually speaking to the nation, being the nation's moral leader, speaking to the extension of rights to all people. And we will listen to that now.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This afternoon, following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required on the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of two clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negro. That they were admitted peacefully on the campus is due in good measure to the conduct of the students of the University of Alabama who met their responsibilities in a constructive way. I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated. But this is not the case. The Negro baby born in America today, regardless of the section of the state in which he is born, has about one-half as much chance of completing a high school as a white baby, born in the same place on the same day. One-third as much chance of completing college. 1/3 as much chance of becoming a professional man, twice as much chance of becoming unemployed, about 1/7 as much chance of earning $10,000 a year, a life expectancy which is 7 years short, and the prospects of earning only half as much. This is not a sectional issue. Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union, producing in many cities a rising tide of discontent that threatens the public safety. Nor is this a partisan issue. In a time of domestic crisis, men of goodwill and generosity should be able to unite regardless of party or politics. This is not even a legal or legislative issue alone. It is better to settle these matters in the courts than on the streets, and new laws are needed at every level. But law alone cannot make men see right. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes? That we have no class or no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes?
There are instances in which the nation experiences tragedy. And in those instances, it is the role of the president to seek to again, just as he is the moral conscience, to pull the nation together and move them forward to do what is morally right. Here, the president pulls the nation together to express our sense of grief when there's tragedy. 9/11, there was a sense of tragedy. The president had to be in that symbolic role to help pull the nation together so that the nation could lick its wounds and focus on the challenge ahead of it. The Reagan, during the Challenger disaster, did that very thing, served to express the nation's grief and focus the nation so that it could move forward and face the challenges ahead. Let's look at Ronald Reagan.
Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. We mourn their loss as a nation together. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
There are points in our history in which the president takes his role in sort of his bully pulpit role to move the nation in new directions, to give the nation a challenge that we had not thought about before. That is, Kennedy faced that in a number of instances. Obama is facing that in some instances with regards to health care and immigration. But Kennedy faced it particularly as he as he challenged the nation to send a man to the moon. This was not thought of previously. It was basically a new direction for the nation, and so we're going to hear President Kennedy as he issues that challenge.
William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead. Whether we join in it or not, we mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond. Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
The president also sits in the role as chief of state. The president is the head of the national government, and as such represents the nation at in any function, and that a nation needs representation, or either a person appointed by the president then can go. The president is the chief administrator of the executive bureaucracy, meaning the president is the boss of the government. So he has the authority to make changes, to restructure the government, and to do things that a large amount of supervisory power over a massive federal bureaucracy. As we have talked, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Our armed forces, unlike many nations, have civilian rule. And this is one of the reasons why you see presidents moving generals out. Generals who have a tendency to be hard-headed, to think of themselves as right, not wanting to be loyal, get moved out. Because in other nations where these generals rise up, in many instances, they're able to lead factions of the military to overthrow the government. That's certainly never happened in the United States, with the exception of the Civil War, and that wasn't mainly a general-led, but that was also a civilian-led government there. But so we've never had generals to sort of rise up and to try to lead factions of the military, but it has in other places. But that is because we have had a strong commander-in-chief, and that commander-in-chief could remove generals and the allegiance that America has to the rule of law. The president is also the chief of his political party. The president plays that informal role as a leader of his political party, but it is a very important role. Anywhere the president goes, the president brings attention. So if his political party is in need of money, the president can go, have hundreds, thousands of people gathering, giving money. Those who want to be seen with the president, who want to have some influence with the president, want some sway, are going to be there. Corporations and business leaders and others will be there, and the president is the fundraiser in chief of the party. Even with the advent of the internet, it is the president, because the president can generate attention, that the president then generates fundraising. As the party leader, the president gets to determine who the head of the party is. And the president also gets the opportunity to go out and campaign for people in the president's political party. And again, because the president can focus the national attention, anytime the president comes and campaigns for you, then that again focuses national attention so that that candidate can raise money, and that candidate also is on the news, and it bolsters that candidate's campaign. The vice president is also a part of the executive branch, sort of. And here's the reason why I say that. Even though the vice president is a constitutional officer, the vice president presides over the Senate. He's actually can vote in case of a tie in the Senate, because remember, the Senate is 100 people. The vice president can vote in case of a tie. He also, or she, can help decide the question of presidential disability. Presidential disability is when the president is unable to carry out the duties, and the only other and the vice president, in fact, has the authority to contribute to that discussion. The only other assumed purpose of the vice president is to be the president in waiting. However, we have had many vice presidents that have been very strong. Obviously, Vice President Cheney was a very, very strong vice president, and in fact, some historians would indicate that he crafted many of the policies of the Bush administration during the first term. Bush began to assert himself later on in the presidency. If the president dies or is unable to serve, the presidential line of succession is listed below. Generally speaking, you don't get down below the vice president. We've never gotten down below the vice president. There was a threat during the Lincoln administration because John Wilkes Booth had planned to kill both Lincoln and the vice president. But the assassin scheduled to kill the vice president withdrew from the plot. But also now, if the president dies or resigns, and the vice president moves up, then that new president then has a vice president appointed to take the vice president's place. So you generally will never go below the vice president. In fact, there was a time in our history when we did have an appointed vice president. In fact, there was a time in our history when no one in the executive branch was elected. They were appointed. During the Nixon administration, Nixon and Spiro Agnew were elected president and vice president. Spiro Agnew was indicted and resigned as the vice president. Nixon then appointed Gerald Ford to be the vice president, and in fact, he was confirmed by the Senate. Then Nixon ended up in the Watergate issue and was in essence forced to resign prior to an inevitable impeachment. At that point, Ford became the president, a man who had never been elected to office. Ford then nominated for his vice president Nelson Rockefeller, a former governor of New York, Republican governor of New York, and all of these are Republicans. And he was again confirmed by the Senate of the United States. So basically, at that point, we had a president and a vice president neither of whom had ever run for national office, nor were they elected by the American public. So the U.S. presidency and executive branch is an interesting part of U.S. government, and this ends this part 2 of this podcast.